Hello, one and all. As always, it is a pleasure to be with my loyal family of listeners again as we go hand in hand down the path of logic and common sense. Of course, as time has gone by, that certainly has become a lonelier journey, has it not? Now, if you're not familiar with the channel, you have tuned in to the Patriot Preacher. I am your humble host, Charles Wells, and I am the Patriot Preacher. So I have to ask you, folks out there who listen, do you have a budget of some sort in your house? Write down your income and expenses, a sort of general guide to make sure that you don't overspend and put yourself in a tight spot before you get paid again. Now, whether you actually write one down or not, I think pretty much all of us do that to one extent or another, even if it's just in our own heads. I mean, it's only common sense, right? So that you don't spend yourself and your family, whom you love very much, into financial oblivion. Well, apparently, Finance 101 was never a required part of the curriculum that any of our lawmakers had to take before they were given the responsibility of administering a $4.1 trillion budget of the United States. Yes, the federal government collected $4.1 trillion in tax revenue in the fiscal year 2021, which averaged out to $12,300 for every man, woman, and child alive in this country. Sounds like a lot, doesn't it? The only problem is that the federal government spent $6.8 trillion in 2021, or $20,600 per person, putting us in debt by another $2.7 trillion just in 1 year. That would be the equivalent of someone, making $50,000, spending almost $83,000 a year. How long would you be able to sustain that in the real world? Can you imagine putting yourself into debt to the tune of more than 30 grand per year forever? Who would even lend you money with spending habits like that? Spending 60% more than you even make. One thing that amazes me about all this is the way that we throw around, the $1 trillion figure. We've become so accustomed to hearing it that we really don't have a concept of how much $1 trillion really is. Now, I'm a statistics kind of guy, I guess you could say. I'm always quick to whip out the calculator to put things into perspective. Let's talk about the concept of $1 billion and $1 trillion, which is comprised of 1,000 billion. If we consider that the US dollar is a little over 6 inches long, about 2.5 inches wide, and paper thin, we can come up with some very revealing statistics. If, for example, you stacked up $1 billion on top of one another, the stack would go 68 miles into the air. Remember, it's paper thin. While if you stacked $1 trillion in the same manner, it would go out into space by 68,000 miles. $1 billion laid end to end would stretch about almost 97,000 miles, winding around the Earth nearly 4 times. While $1 trillion laid in the same way would stretch for almost 97 million miles, a distance that's further from here to the sun. If you laid $1 billion side by side, like they were tiles, they would cover about 4 square miles. $1 trillion laid out the same way would cover almost 4,000 square miles, or an area that's 1,000 square miles larger than the states of Rhode Island and Delaware combined. Finally, how long would it take to spend each one of those amounts? If you spent $40 per second around the clock, it would take you about 289 days to exhaust $1 billion. If you did the same thing with $1 trillion, it would take you almost 800 years to do the same thing, to go broke. In other words, boys and girls, $1 trillion is an incredibly large amount of money. I remember when I was a kid in elementary school, how the teacher used similar techniques that I just gave you to get us to understand the difference between $1 million and $1 billion. The term trillion wasn't even used because there was nothing in our lives that approached that figure. We didn't get the first $1 trillion deficit until 1981 when I was 21 years old. And while the deficit was going up before then, it went up very moderately and modestly. Certainly nothing alarming like it is now. I don't know about you, but I love to spend money, at least when I have it. And there have been times in my life even when I didn't really have it. But the fact of the matter is, we can't simply continue doing this. Every good thing comes to an end, including spending sprees, one way or another. The problem is that there seems to be no incentive on the part of our representatives to rein in spending. You see, spending allows them to appeal to their voters by giving them stuff. They essentially buy their votes, if you want to look at it like that. Additionally, politicians, at least in this day and age, are largely a very short-sighted group of people who are intent on keeping themselves in power regardless of the consequences on our great nation. Do you realize that the United States government hasn't passed an actual budget since 1996? The federal budget that funds our activities of our country is divided into 12 appropriation bills that should be passed before the beginning of each fiscal year, which starts on October 1st. Each bill funds separate departments and activities of the government to include things like the military, education, Social Security, highway construction, and all the funds passed on to the states and local governments and across the country and so forth. Although they should approve an annual budget each year, the last time both houses of Congress passed a budget before the start of the fiscal year was in 1996, the last year of Bill Clinton's first term. So, while every company and household in America has to have a budget to survive, the federal government hasn't had a budget in 26 years. Even though federal law requires both houses to pass a budget every year that is supposed to outline spending for the next decade. But since 1996, Congress has become increasingly polarized and unable to reach bipartisan agreements on issues like immigration, defense spending, and funding for social programs, including Medicare. Congress seems to get into our business about almost everything, don't they? That is, things that are no concern to them, but dismally fail in their primary function, which is to wisely manage our money. And I have to emphasize, our money. When Congress fails to perform their primary function, the federal government is at risk of running out of money for the year, and a government shutdown becomes a real possibility. Now, as bizarre as that sounds, the U.S. government can actually shut down and stop working for the most part. Although essential services like, the military, federal law enforcement, FAA, airport traffic controllers continue to operate. But non-essential services are stopped, to include staffing at national parks, Department of Justice gun background checks, and all National Guard staff and civilian military workers. Honestly, I think their bluff should be called and the government should be allowed to shut down. It seems to me that they do a lot less harm to us when they're not supposedly working on our behalf. Although there are people who suffer when the shutdowns do occur, namely federal employees, when shutdowns are extensive. They lose paychecks. But during shutdowns, you know who doesn't stop getting paid? You got it, members of Congress. They get paid even though they fail to perform one of the most important aspects of their jobs. And when the budget doesn't get passed on time and Congress doesn't want to face the wrath of angry citizens, they pass what they call short-term funding bills called continuing resolutions, also known as CRs for short. The CRs can provide funding for specific federal departments and programs for anywhere for a few days up to a full year. The process to pass CRs is usually a political deal where programs important to one party are traded for those important to the other. This practice should be, and at one time was, a rare event. Unfortunately, our Congress has passed over 112 continuing resolutions since 1998. Although sometimes it only takes 2 or 3 CRs to get to a full budget, in some years it has taken 5 or 8 or even 21 CRs as it did in 2021. In total, over the past 20 years, our country has gone 1,815 days without a real budget in place. But sometimes Congress fails to reach even a short-term deal for a continuing resolution until finally the government shuts down, even though most shutdowns only last about a day. So you might be asking me, why am I even talking about all this? Well, many of you may be wondering why we are going through such an incredibly inflationary period of time in our history right now. If you're living on any kind of fixed income right now, you're finding it more and more difficult to make ends meet. That $1 an hour raise you just got doesn't mean much if it costs you $3 more an hour to live, does it? Our lawmakers try to play down what's going on, but inflation is worse now than it has been in 4 decades when Jimmy Carter was in the Oval Office. It's standing at about 7% right now, which, believe me, is a conservative estimate because they're trying to downplay it. This means that the dollar last year is only worth about 93 cents now. You may have heard all sorts of explanations about why this is going on, and you're really not sure what to believe because, everybody blames everybody else. Honestly, it's not an extraordinarily difficult concept to understand. The fact is that we are printing money at an unprecedented rate with nothing of real value to back it up. And when you flood the marketplace with anything, to include money, it becomes less valuable. When something becomes more rare, it becomes more valuable. When there's an overabundance, like there is with money, it becomes cheaper. And when money means less, it takes more of it to purchase what you need to get by. And there you have it. I've now given you more knowledge of inflation and how it occurs than members of Congress apparently know. There's nothing mysterious about it, folks. If we are living, in fact, in perilous times, on a bunch of fronts, not the least of which is the financial arena. I truly fear for the financial stability of our nation because of the reckless and selfish behavior of our lawmakers. They do not serve us, they do not care about us, and ultimately they do not represent us. Now, of course, I'm using sweeping generalizations. There are certainly some that do, but there are more that do not care than those that do. We are quickly coming to a crossroads, folks. If our feckless leaders do not reasonably perform their responsibilities soon, the damage will be beyond repair. When this country goes truly broke and all of our social programs like Social Security, welfare, food stamps, Medicare, Medicaid cannot be paid for, it will create a financial crisis that will rival the Great Depression. But make no mistake about it, that crisis will not go to waste either. This will be when the federal government steps in as it always does and saves the day again on a crisis that it created. That is when digital currency will be used on a wider basis. President Biden's signed, in fact, an executive order to explore cryptocurrency like digital dollar. When the entire system catastrophically fails and collapses and people are at their most fearful and desperate, they will allow the government to control, to tighten as they just did during the COVID pandemic. They will offer you cryptocurrency for your cash dollars that are no longer worth anything. And we will be firmly in the territory of the Great Reset in the hands of billionaire globalists, where your every financial move will be accounted for and subject to someone else's scrutiny and approval, which was the plan the entire time. Well, my brothers and sisters, it's once again time for me to go. I have blathered on long enough. I hope you enjoyed our thought-provoking conversation. If you did, please take the time to get notifications of new content, make cogent comments, and most importantly, support the channel by hitting that little subscribe button in the bottom right-hand corner. Until next time, I hope you and your family are safe, happy, and able to weather the idiocy of our appointed leaders. Goodbye, and God bless.